tomorrow there will be a public action on the streets of Porto in which a leaflet that was first dropped over East Timor in 1944 by the Royal Australian Air Force will be redistributed through the streets of the city. The leaflet was first dropped in the context of the Japanese occupation of East Timor, after Australian troops had fought alongside East Timorese troops against the Japanese occupation, but then withdrew to Australia. And the intention of the leaflet was to encourage the East Timorese to continue to resist the Japanese occupation. And it came, this propaganda leaflet had a very famous title, or at least famous in both Australia and East Timor, that your friends do not forget you, and it ended with the line, your turn will come. And this became very famous in Australia because in the subsequent years when the Indonesian army occupied East Timor, Australia was the country which most heavily supported the Indonesian occupation of East Timor. And so this leaflet and its promise that your friends do not forget you became a very important document as a way to insist upon a more moral position against the Indonesian occupation of East Timor. What's interesting for me is that the document, of course, is written in Portuguese, but by an Australian. So it's a very imperfect and in a way complicated use of Portuguese language. So the leaflet contains a spelling mistake even in its title, which I think indicates something of the strangeness of the whole enterprise in a way to communicate from Australia, a British colony, into East Timor under Japanese occupation in the language of the former coloniser. And I made a work in 1999, just before the United Nations referendum in East Timor, in which I distributed drawings of this leaflet to friends in East Timor. And one of the things that I found interesting about that first iteration of this action was that although all of my East Timorese friends knew the document, because it's historically famous, none of them could in fact read it because they were all educated in Bahasa Indonesia. And for me, what's interesting about this context in a way is that the language belongs to this place, to Porto, but the physical location has been displaced. And I guess one of the things that I think is interesting is the way in which the language and this kind of, you could almost say an archaeology of language in East Timor reflects this very complex and very horrific colonial history. There's a component of the work which describes the history of East Timor, its colonial history, in all of the different colonial languages which have passed through the country, which is intended to cue this understanding about the relationship between language and colonial history. But to me there's also something interesting in the propaganda leaflet itself, in that it is language which makes a certain promise. It's about promising something into the future. And for me, both in this work and in lots of other works, I like to play between language which is a way to record or testify to something in the past, and also language which is a way to imaginatively project into the future. And I think really these historical materials are only interesting and important if they also not only address the past, but they also address the future, and so that there is an unstable relationship between what has occurred in the past and what we can imagine for our future. So tomorrow there will actually be two parts to the action. There's the leaflet distribution, which I've already described, in which 80 people will fan out from Plaza de Liberdade and distribute this leaflet, which was first distributed in 1944. But there's a second component which in a way echoes the way in which the leaflet was first distributed, and that is two aeroplanes that circle above Porto, one towing a text with the first line of the leaflet, so your friends do not forget you, in Portuguese, and then the second one with the last line, your turn will come, which is written in English, and they circle above the streets of Porto at the same time that this distribution happens. And so one of the components which is in the installation, which is the trace of the action, is footage which is shot from a third aeroplane of these texts hovering above the streets of Porto. And to me there's something interesting about figuring the relationship between Australia, East Timor and Portugal through the space of the sky. So for me this becomes an important way in which to find a space in which, and it's an imaginary space in a way, but nonetheless a very, very powerful one, where these three physical locations meet in a very powerful historical and political constellation, but also I think the thing that's very striking about being here is that Portugal is one of the few places, like Australia, where East Timor is not just politically and historically important, but is also emotionally important, because people here have an investment in that struggle and in that history, which means that it's not a neutral or dry political matter. It's something in which there is a very particular charge, and that is the space in which this work originated in Australia, where East Timor, and particularly for my generation and for earlier generations, East Timor was a very, very important and emotionally charged subject.